I don't know. Oh, there you go. We're live. Okay. All right, y'all. Let's dive in. Welcome everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is C. Terrence Anderson, Director of Community-Based Research at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, or CURA, a public policy research center here at the University of Minnesota. I'm doing my best to fill in for Ed. Sorry, he's not here. If he's who you came here to see, but we've got some other great folks here to talk about social housing in Minnesota, the campaign for locally owned and controlled housing as our next CURA Housing Forum. So welcome to the folks who are here for the first time. Welcome to the folks who are here online. And I think we've got a really good conversation happening. For us, social housing, the concept of social housing is beginning to gain traction in various jurisdictions around the United States. While there is no one set definition, social housing is usually marked by permanent affordability of rental units, public ownership or control of those units, affordability for a wide range of incomes, and some level of democratic control for its residents. So in some counties and some jurisdictions across Minnesota, there's increasing demand for more public housing units to be created and maintained across our various communities. These are some folks who are working on this very issue. I'll let them introduce themselves here in just a second to talk about that movement here in Minnesota and beyond, and to get more insight into it. So with that, I will pass it to our first panelist, Jen.
Thank you. I just have to say first, I have a little cold. You can hear it in my voice. I might not speak quite as much as I was planning to, and wave if you can't hear me. I'm doing my best. My name is Jennifer Arnold, and I am the Executive Director of Inquilinos Unidos por Justicia, or Renters United for Justice. We are a renter organization in Minneapolis that was founded to build tenant unions with low-income renters who rent from the same landlord. And it's a long story that eventually brought us to social housing, which we'll tell you a little bit about. So I'm gonna start, and then Alibella Rodriguez is gonna come up and speak. She's a board member at Inquilinos Unidos. She's gonna talk about how we got here, and then we are going to, we're gonna talk about what social housing is, what it looks like, and what's happening already in Minnesota and around the country. Sean Burke is gonna be presenting with me, and also Eric Harris Bernstein. So we'll sort of take it from there. Yeah, yeah, I can probably do this. Oh yeah, so here's a little bit of our agenda for today, and we'll have some questions at the end, and I'll speak as much as I can, and then I'll stop when I can't. Thanks for putting up with me. Olivia, ¿quieren? ¿Cómo empezar? Oh yeah, I was gonna do this part, but I'm gonna rest my voice and have someone else interpret.
Hola, buenas tardes. Mi nombre es Alibella Rodríguez. Yo vivo en el sur de Minneapolis con mi familia, que es mi esposo y mis 3 hijos.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Alibella Rodriguez, and I live in South Minneapolis with my husband and 3 children.
Yo pertenezco a la organización de Inquilinos Unidos por Justicia.
I belong to the organization Inquilinos Unidos por Justicia, or IX.
Quiero contar un poquito de mi experiencia luchando como inquilina los últimos 6 años, que es mi experiencia de todas las familias que luchamos con los inquilinos.
I want to tell you a little about my experience fighting as a tenant for the last 6 years, which is very similar to all families who fight with IX.
Voy a hablar un poco de lo que llamamos ciclo de organizar en vivienda, y lo siguiente es cómo se ve el ciclo.
I'm going to talk about what we call the cycle of housing organizing. This is what the cycle looks like.
Los inquilinos que compartimos un dueño nos juntamos para compartir nuestras experiencias de vivienda. Empezamos a organizar acerca de nuestros problemas en común. Empezamos pidiendo reparaciones, y el dueño encuentra excusas para negar o ignora nuestras peticiones, porque sabe que el sistema le favorece a él y no a nosotros.
Tenants who share a landlord get together and share their experiences in their housing. We start organizing around our shared problems. We start asking for repairs, and the owner finds excuses to deny or ignore our requests. The landlord knows the system favors them and not us.
En mi caso, el dueño no hacía reparaciones, así que nosotros hicimos muchas de nuestras propias reparaciones porque no podíamos esperar. Queríamos vivir en buenas condiciones para nuestros niños.
In my case, the landlord didn't respond to our repair requests, so we did many of our own repairs because we couldn't afford to wait. We wanted to live in good, healthy conditions with our children. After the landlord got frustrated with us, saying that we hadn't told him about our repair dates.
El dueño después se enojaba diciendo que no le habíamos avisado que necesitábamos reparaciones. Sí. Eventualmente el dueño hace reparaciones, pero responde con el aumento de renta. Hace reglas más estrictas que nos amenaza con desalojarnos. Por ejemplo, en mi caso, el dueño nos quiso desalojar en invierno y como saben que en invierno es una fecha muy difícil para poder encontrar un lugar donde vivir y es una época de compartir, de felicidad, cosa que nosotros no tuvimos.
Eventually, the landlord agrees to repairs, but responds by increasing the rent, making stricter rules, threatening to displace us, evict us. For example, in my case, the owner wanted to evict us in the middle of winter, which you know is the hardest time to find a place. It's also time when we're supposed to be with our families.
Nos quiso desalojar en mera Navidad. El dueño quiso desalojarnos y nos cobraba renta, aún sabiendo que él no tenía licencia para cobrar renta, cosa que a él no le importó.
He wanted to kick us out just during Christmas. The owner wanted to evict us and charge us rent, even though he did not have a license to rent.
Este es un ciclo. Lo siguiente que pasa es que el dueño decide vender el edificio. En nuestro caso, empeoró la situación con el nuevo dueño y la presión de desalojo fue aún más fuerte. Tuvimos que buscar en dónde irnos, que fue muy frustrante porque no podíamos encontrar lugar. Tuvimos que irnos a corte para negociar una salida que funcionara para nosotros, no para él.
In this cycle, the next thing that happens is that the owner decides to sell the building. In my case, the situation got worse. The pressure to move was stronger, and we had to look for a place to live, which was very stressful. In my case, we had to go to court to negotiate a way out that worked for us.
La realidad es que un nuevo dueño no es una victoria en nuestro sistema actual. Muchas veces un nuevo dueño quiere recuperar lo que invirtió comprando el edificio. Así que las condiciones solamente empeoran y el ciclo empieza nuevamente. Nuestra membresía ha aprendido que el problema no es el dueño específicamente, sino el sistema que tenemos actualmente.
The reality is a new landlord is not a win in our current system. Often the new landlord wants to make back the money that they spent in the sale, so conditions only get worse. And then the cycle starts from the beginning. Our membership has learned that the problem is not one specific landlord, but the entire system set up for a system of housing, the whole system we have today.
Por este motivo, estamos buscando soluciones a largo plazo para que yo y otras familias estemos mejor, que vivamos en mejores condiciones y que paguemos una renta justa. Esto es especialmente muy importante para nosotros y para que nuestros hijos sigan estudiando y tengan un mejor futuro.
For this reason, we are looking for long-term solutions so that my family and other families are better off, that we live in better conditions, and that we pay fairer rent. This is especially important so that our children can continue studying to have a better future.
Vivienda social es una de estas soluciones porque es vivienda pública, no privada, cuyo fin es que las familias tengan mejor calidad de vida en vez de ganancias para el dueño. Eso permitiría pagar menos renta y mejores condiciones de vida y dignidad.
Social housing is one of these solutions because it is public housing, not private, and its purpose is for families to have better quality of life instead of profits for the owner. That would allow us to pay less rent and live with better conditions with dignity.
Creo que si todos, estudiantes, padres, familias y comunidad, nos uniéramos para el bien y para el bien de todos, podemos ganar esto. Así mejoraremos la vida de todas las familias y de nuestra comunidad y para que nuestros hijos tengan mejor futuro y oportunidades en la vida.
I believe that if we all, students, parents, community, come together for the good of all, we can win this. This is how we improve life for all the families in our community, especially for our children and their futures.
Gracias.
Thank you.
So thank you, Olivia, for sharing that story. I think it really matters for us to ground in that story because we came to social housing through the fight that renters have in their homes, right? And wanting to get out of this cycle. And the only way that we get out of this cycle is that we look for alternatives to housing for profit. So I want to talk a little bit about what social housing is. C. Terrence named it at the beginning, but it is housing that is either collectively owned or publicly owned. And that means, so collective ownership would be like in a cooperative. That means permanent affordability. That means it's preserved always for its purpose as housing, not as somebody's chance to make money off of it. It's socially equitable. And what we mean when we say that is that it is for people of all incomes and all backgrounds. For us, the background piece is super important because a lot of it doesn't matter, what your status in the country is. But socially equitable is also very important because it means that people of different incomes can live there and pay different rents. So the people who are paying higher rents are supporting, sort of subsidizing the folks who are paying lower rents. And that, a lot of folks that we work with live in housing that's for all low income people, and there's not dignity in that housing, right? It's a way to ensure that the quality stays good. And it's also a way to ensure sustainability in the long term. It's a way to continue to fund the housing so that it's, you don't run into the problem of being like, we can't make this work. Additionally, social housing includes a part of democratic control. So that means that either residents are controlling what happens in their housing through things like a cooperative board or a resident board, but also that it is responsive to local politics. So if this is housing, we're talking about being built and owned by cities and counties so that folks can go to county officials and ask for responses when things aren't being kept the way that they should. I'm going to pass it to Sean.
All right, so I'll do a quick introduction of myself, and the other panelists who come up here can do that as well. So my name is Sean Burke. I'm a consultant and a lobbyist with O'Connell Consulting. We've been working with IX for over the last year to work on issues related to social housing, both at the local and the state level. Our firm works with organizations, movement organizations, and nonprofits across the state to work for collective change on issues related to healthcare, childcare, and housing. So we come at this from both a state level lens and a really local lens. And I think the reason we wanted to start off with kind of that lived experience is because what you'll hear throughout this presentation is a lot of the solutions to quote unquote affordable housing or affordable crisis are not working for a variety of reasons. But one of them is because people on the ground living in substandard housing have not been able to mobilize and have their voices heard in a real way. It's oftentimes others speaking on their behalf saying, oh, we got this solution, this government program, this, and this. And so it's unique in social housing in that it's really coming from the grassroots. And for reasons that Eric will talk about, we really need that to happen to mobilize change at the Capitol, especially at our state level. These next two slides are really just kind of setting some basic context that I think if you hear anything about housing crisis or housing in Minnesota, these will resonate and they just kind of drive home the point with some images. So the dark red in this picture are cost burden renters, and so all of the red is cost burden renters. The darkest red is your cost burden up to 48 to 56% of your income going towards rent. Of course, 30% is kind of the benchmark of cost burden, and most of Minnesota for renters are above that level. So it just drives home the fact that this is also a statewide problem. You'll notice our greater Minnesota rural counties are some of the most cost burden, and oftentimes when housing solutions are pitched, especially at the Capitol, it's pitched as this kind of, well, we need to fix kind of urban areas, and Minneapolis or St. Paul lawmakers kind of making all these real progressive
changes, but we think this is actually a statewide solution and it's very localized. We'll talk about that as well, because the need is extremely local. There's also a housing production mismatch in Minnesota, and what we mean by that is the housing that is getting produced. We have a lack of production across the board, but the housing that is getting produced, especially rental housing, is really designed for higher income renters. And so we have a huge dearth of deeply affordable housing. We also have a lack of affordable housing throughout the AMI spectrum. And that's important because when things get built, the scarcity for deeply affordable or affordable is so acute, it drives the pressure across the system. And again, we think social housing is one response to this. You'll hear this throughout our presentation, but the unique solution that social housing, or as we call it in Minnesota, locally owned and controlled housing, brings is that it provides a level of sustainability because the model is developed to include a wide variety of rental needs. And again, as Jen mentioned, the higher market rate renters in this publicly owned housing are essentially subsidizing the lower renters. They're also helping create enough funding so that there's operating costs ongoing, which is really one of the key challenges of affordable housing in our current system. So let's get into that a little bit. I'm going to spend the next few slides talking about why our current affordable system doesn't work for so many reasons, and why we need new solutions in this space. I'm going to talk about it both from the mechanics of the programs themselves, but also from the organizing perspective. What I alluded to earlier is that nothing around funding more LIHTC is going to get a broad base coalition of people together and go fight for it. I don't think we will ever get a whole bunch of unions and movement organizations and people on the ground who can actually push for more funding, saying more LIHTC today, more LIHTC tomorrow, more LIHTC forever. Again, we think that's one of the problems with the current solution is not just the mechanism is flawed, but there's nothing about it that actually can sustain large social movements that you need to fund big public investments. Think our school system, right? If you take away our public school system, you will have every lower middle class family, every middle class family, every teacher in the state at the Capitol fighting tooth and nail to keep that system. And not only if you take it away, if you just don't fund it or don't put enough funding into it, you have a large vocal majority pushing for that system, which is one of the reasons why that system is sustained. I'll leave aside all the flaws of that system for today, even though some of them also touch on part of the racial inequality pieces that we hope social housing can address. Okay, so we believe there's an investment vacuum and a lack of sustainable public models. Why is affordable housing such a difficult problem to solve? Well, because in many ways, the federal government has abdicated sustained investments in this space. It put a bunch of money into public housing at one point and has fully kind of pulled back from that. Then it put a bunch of money into vouchers or project-based programs and has never funded those to the level that they need. So there's a dearth of federal financing, even though the states are basically like, well, financing is a federal or affordable housing is a federal issue. We rely on them. Meanwhile, the feds are giving us peanuts relative to the need. We also have other affordable solutions, namely LIHTC, as kind of the more privatized solution to affordable housing. And one of the slides we have at the end is or a series of resources, but CURA just did a memo working in partnership with IX last semester into this semester that shows at least just kind of the tip of the iceberg of some of the flaws of LIHTC, including the fact that there's a lot of leakage in this program. As soon as you put public investment into the LIHTC, a lot of it kind of dissipates into the private market without actually developing the affordable units that it's supposed to develop. Plus, it's not necessarily permanently affordable because of the time parameters around LIHTC. So what we like to say is LIHTC is essentially, it's not super affordable and it's not super housing. It's not a lot of housing and it's not very affordable. Because of the interplay, that we have this federal dynamic, it's also led to an atrophy or even a non-existent state investment in this space. Eric will talk about this a little bit more, but it's just stunning when you go to the Capitol and you realize, yeah, we have a housing committee, but the amount of money that they get to spend from our federal budget is literally almost non-existent. You'll see a chart in just a second. And that again is because we've kind of ceded that to the federal government. But we believe there is space for state investment. It has to be smart. The state isn't going to suddenly be able to produce the billions of dollars necessary that you need to give everyone a voucher or something like that. But with smart strategic investments in things like social housing, it can utilize its funding in a lot better ways. We also know that local investment, like cities and counties, especially Hennepin County, they want to address this problem. They got a lot of money from COVID, especially Hennepin County, to do things around homelessness, which is great, but those dollars are also not sustainable. And that is also a very expensive system to keep up, just to keep up the demands of the deeply affordable side of things. And so again, the current solutions that we have out there don't have that sustainability part of them. So then this feeds kind of a catch-22 problem, because then the question is, okay, we don't have good solutions. That also means we don't have a lot of advocacy at the state level or at the federal level, but especially at the levels that we advocate for at the state. So we have few power players who really are invested in housing at the state level. What I mean by power players, again, going back to the school example, Education Minnesota, the teachers union, has a lot of power, not just in their kind of demanding certain policy changes, but demanding more investments. And so as a result, our education system, or as part of a result, our education system in Minnesota gets a huge portion of our state budget every year. We also don't have a state agency that's designed to fix the problem. Our state agency is essentially the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. This is an overcharacterization, but it's essentially a place for the LIHTC funding to flow through and then be distributed. It's kind of like a giant bank or grant distributor. It's not a state agency the way the Minnesota Department of Education or the Department of Human Services is, which takes a whole lot more holistic approach. And I have many critiques about the Department of Human Services, but it runs our Medicaid system. And it's not just a pass-through of Medicaid. It's also trying to address where our healthcare needs are in the state. Again, it doesn't do it perfectly, but we don't have anything like that in terms of our housing situation. We don't have the big base organizations that I mentioned that are focused on housing because they're not going to run out and save more money for LIHTC, as I said. And we have this really kind of diffusion problem about who should be the target. Really, who should we be asking for? Should we go to the feds? Should we go to cities? Should we go to counties? Should we go to private actors? Should we go to the state? Every time you go to one of those actors, they kind of point to all the other ones. Say, well, they're the problem, they're the problem, they're the problem. Again, social housing, as we're going to talk about, locally owned and controlled housing, provides some answer to this because it does create some cooperation between the state, cities, and the counties in a way that helps to at least kind of alleviate this diffusion problem. And again, we also have a lack of agreement on the solution. You go out and ask people who work in the housing space in Minnesota, like, how do we fix this? You're going to get a ton of different answers. And none of those answers are necessarily bad, but each of those answers in and of themselves will either cost a lot of money or create a lot of need for a campaign to be built around. And we got to kind of make choices eventually. And so this is kind of the landscape that we entered into this space on and decided to kind of, as we started to test the idea of, okay, how do we do this social housing in Minnesota? We have to take into account all of these issues and limitations. I want to make one more point here. These next slides really just kind of hammer home everything I've been talking about. I do want to hammer home the point of sustainability, and then I'm going to turn it over to Eric, and he's going to dive in more to why social housing is a good solution. Nope.
Like that. So.
Sorry.
Can I just take a quick picture?
Sure, go ahead. And we're going to send these out when we're done as well. You want to go do it? Good. Okay. Why don't we detour, or not detour? Well, let's stay here for a minute and examine a little deeper about why LIHTC has some deep flaws to it.
I always
What
want,
it is.
I always want to take a chance to talk about LIHTC because it makes me so mad. So I'm going to do it even though I can't really speak. So LIHTC stands for Low Income Housing Tax Credits. Yes, Terrence is nodding because we've been talking about this for years. So in the 80s, when the federal government moved away from funding public housing, they made this public-private partnership called LIHTC. So this is the way that they decided to build affordable housing. And what it means is they grant tax credits to states, and the states then disperse the tax credits to developers who then use them to build housing that is kept affordable for a certain amount of time. So the federal regulation is that LIHTC housing must be kept affordable for 15 years. In the state of Minnesota in the 2010s, they increased that to 30 years, but that's not very much time. Additionally, LIHTC, low income housing tax credits, is not money, it's a tax credit, a promise of not having to pay taxes in the future. So to actually build something with it, the developer has to take it to a bank or a wealthy person to exchange it for money to build the housing. So that's where we get that leakage, the like losing public money in that exchange, and in also the way that the housing is set up. A bunch of money is lost on the front end that goes to banks and to wealthy people. And then affordable housing is built. And then again, because the tax credit runs out after 15 or 30 years, then people become in a bind. So I don't know if y'all heard about Crossroads or Concierge. That was the housing development in Richfield that had space for 800 families. It was about 5 years ago that the tax credit ran out. The building was sold to a new owner, and the new owner increased the rent on all the renters living there. And it displaced so many people that it changed the character of the Richfield School District, right? Like this is very serious stuff. And that's why this says in the next slide, sometimes, oh, maybe it's not there, but sometimes like local municipalities feel held hostage by these projects because when the tax credit runs out, they come to the city or the county and say, look, we're gonna raise rents here unless you give us another tax break. This, I just, like, I can't, I get so mad about this. This is public money. Imagine spending public money on public housing that stays public forever instead of public money on private developers that then later can do what they want with it. It's really maddening. So thank you for letting me do that.
I'm really glad you did, because I do think our examination of LIHTC and similar programs like it, our state funds a lot of other similar state funded programs that the State Housing Agency, Minnesota Housing Finance Agency runs. They're all kind of similar birds of a feather in this regard. And they're also extremely complex. And I think adds to the frustration in this space because you look at these programs and they're very frustrating and counties and others feel hostage, and they're also very complex to understand. And so there's a lot of the kind of sleight of hand, well, let's just trust the developer because they know what they're doing. We've created such a complex beast that the counties or the cities themselves are never going to be able to figure that out. We'll continue to let public housing do public housing stuff, but there's no way we're going to get into the housing business ourselves. We hear this critique sometimes in this space because it's so complex and the private market's already doing it. And part of what we're learning is like, no, the private market's not doing it well. It is complex, but it's complex because of the mechanisms we've created, not necessarily because of the issues themselves. One more slide to dive a little bit deeper into in this space, just to hit home this issue of sustainability, because it is very, very similar. You'll notice kind of the cycle that was talked about earlier about how tenant organizing comes to be. And it's so predictable. Every single building you can see eventually ends in a sale and then raise the rents and the whole cycle starts again. Well, part of what's happening is the structure itself is designed to kind of perpetuate a cycle like this, like Jen just mentioned. So our now public housing, to the extent that it exists, is caught up so much in LIHTC or things like it, these low-income housing tax credits, maybe some private capital loans. That's the initial investment. We put it into, and then it will be turned into some type of affordable housing, or there'll be some units that are affordable. But because there's this private element to it, there's a pressure to create profit. And you also have to accommodate the deeply affordable units that are now in this building, and you have to fund operating costs. So when you start to do the math of these buildings, they don't add up, especially after the 15 or 30 years run out. And so a lot of the private actors get out of the business or leave the business. And then especially in Minnesota, our nonprofit space, we have a huge set of nonprofit developers and nonprofit entities that own and operate housing. And that whole system has come to be in large part because they got to kind of pick up the externalities that the private market has left behind. So they inherit some of these buildings. Sometimes they try to develop themselves with kind of really thin, razor thin operating margins. And they're not necessarily trying to make a profit because they're nonprofit, but they are definitely trying to juggle all of these low AMIs that exist in there, and it is really hard to make it work. And so both the private developers who ask cities for tax breaks and the nonprofit developers who go to the legislature or the cities and say, hey, we need a bailout, we need money, or our actual public housing also come to the state and say, we need operating costs, we need expenses. And so these operating costs, while they're not the upfront costs, they happen, 10, 15, 20, every 5 years or so, the periods are different based on the building. But now they're coming back and asking for more money. So then we just put more money into the system, both in those buildings, or if we let those buildings go, we got to create new affordable buildings. So the whole system kind of cycles over again. All the while we're putting all of our public money, the public money we're putting in this space, we're not recapturing. The taxpayers and the public really aren't seeing the full benefit of that. We're putting a lot of those externalities in Minnesota on our nonprofit sector, to be perfectly honest, in a lot of places. Okay, so we see this problem. We're a bit overwhelmed, but we have other models to look at. And when you start hearing about social housing, you may hear about Europe first and foremost. You may hear about places like Vienna, which are incredible models. But when you go to the state capitol and you start talking with a bunch of lawmakers from across Minnesota, if you use the word social housing or you use the word Vienna, they're going to kick you out of your office, except for maybe 5 or 6 of them. And so we do have to talk about how we take the concepts of social housing and kind of make them malleable and for Minnesota. We're going to get to that in a little bit. I want to turn it over to Eric, and he's going to talk a little bit more about his organization, why they are so interested in social housing as a solution, and as I alluded to earlier, talk a little bit more about kind of what's needed at the Capitol as well. So Eric, tell us a little bit more about yourself and take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Bernstein. I run a labor grassroots coalition, and we work mostly on fiscal policy issues. So I spend most of my time advocating for state and local funding and working on the state's tax code and basically making the argument that our public dollars create a lot of value, whether it's funding education or infrastructure or healthcare, and that we should keep doing that, and that Minnesota should be proud to be a relatively higher tax, higher spending state, and that we have a lot of good things to show for that. So I got interested in this social housing idea, though, because in that role, I see how difficult the job of funding government really is. We do have a lot of unmet needs, and we already do have taxes that are higher than a lot of other states. I would say they're lower than most other developed countries, but that doesn't always help us politically. And so, we have this difficult job of trying to fund a good society, a just society where everybody can afford to live a dignified life and have their basic needs met. And yet we find it's a really uphill battle, even with our, sort of revenues and our spending where it's at. And so, so why housing? I guess I kind of reverse these two. I'll start. For one thing is we don't spend very much money on it, right? This is the chair of the House Taxes Committee, Mike Howard. He's a great guy, and he walks around with a gallon jug of water, and he likes to say that if this gallon is our state budget, we spend 1 tablespoon on housing. So 1 tablespoon out of that whole gallon is what the Housing Finance Committee gets to control out of the state budget. Now, there's a couple of other pots of money that go to housing. bonding gets a little bit, and there's some buried in the HHS budget that helps keep people out of long-term housing. But at most, it's 4 tablespoons, okay? So it's not very much money out of that whole pot. Oh, here, yeah, sorry, I made this graph. So, there's housing finance and the housing support budget, which is what I mentioned in HHS. And in 2020 and 2021 biennium and the 22-23 biennium, you can barely even see them. We spent a decent chunk in 24-25. Historically, housing finance had $1 billion budget. So that was a lot more than they usually get, but it's still not very much. And why this matters, there's bonding. We spend a slightly larger chunk, but still a small percent, less than 10% of our bonding budget goes to housing. And why we should care about this is because we believe that housing lies upstream of many other social issues, right? When you don't have a stable house, your place to call home, your education outcomes are going to be worse, your health outcomes are going to be worse. You're less likely to be able to find and keep stable jobs, income, and have just sort of a lot of face a lot of uphill battles. And so, you can use homelessness as an example. There's many estimates out there of how much it costs the state and local governments to support the unhoused population through emergency room visits, police response, and all of the many insufficient ways in which we try to meet that need right now. And, I think there's a strong and growing consensus in the state that addressing housing needs is the best place to start for a lot of these difficult outcomes that we are trying to help with. And so we spend very little, and we think spending very little costs us a lot. And so that's just sort of from a fiscal policy perspective, like a basic, sort of strategic blunder that we are making when we don't invest in this basic need, and then we try to catch all these downstream problems, whether it's in health or it's in education. Teachers union is in my coalition, and we hear all the time about one of the greatest stresses of being a teacher is that you're working with a population that is also that is often very underserved. So your job as a teacher becomes more stressful, and the school environment is more stressful. And so these things really mount up. And so between the fact that we're not really investing in it and it has a lot of downstream costs, housing is a great place to start with thinking about where could we try to find more money for state investment. And so why social housing particularly? What do we like about it? Well, one thing that's very important is the cross subsidy. So right now we have a problem where there's lots of money in the housing market. There are a lot of people making money in the housing market. My slides are not in a great order, but here is the net operating income growth of real estate investment trusts. There's lots of people making money in the housing market. There was another slide I had up here that had the totals. It's trillions of dollars of equity in real estate investment trusts, and that's just one vehicle for private investment in housing. And so we're essentially letting these sort of high-end housing providers take up all the profits. And then this is sort of what Sean said, we're letting nonprofit and affordable housing developers try and piece together a housing market with the renters mostly who can't really afford, a market rent. And so there's all this money going into housing, but it's just not going to the places where we need it to subsidize like a market, to create a market that really works for everyone. So where were we? So the basic sort of mechanism that makes social housing so interesting is the mixed income model. So you develop a unit, or a building, it's 1,000 units, let's say, and you use the market rent, the profits on market rate rents, to cross-subsidize the losses on the affordable units. So in Maryland, in Montgomery County, Maryland, which is probably the place where they're doing this model most prominently, they can usually create 20 to 30% of units affordable at 50 to 80% of AMI by using this cross-subsidy model. So these folks represented in the red box are paying, in this example, 30% below the fair market or the state cost threshold rather, so even lower than the fair market. And then there's profits being generated on their market rate units. This is obviously like very, very simplified, but that's the basic idea. The reason, like, sort of another way to like illustrate this is that we are trying to use social housing. We're using this mixed income model as a way to escape the Medicaid problem. Now, what's the Medicaid problem? In the United States, taxpayers fund health care for the oldest and the lowest income Americans. So we have Medicaid, which is healthcare for lower income people, and Medicare, which is healthcare for retirees over 65 years in general. And there's some other people that fall into those pockets. But naturally, those are going to be people with the highest cost of healthcare, and that's the job, and that job falls to US taxpayers to fund. Meanwhile, there's private markets for healthcare that are serving generally healthier, higher income, and less costly patients. And so this chart just kind of, it's a little illustration of that. But when you see the bars indicate the share that are supported by public housing, public healthcare, and then how they rate their own health. So if you look at the folks who report very good or excellent health, they're almost half as likely to be on some form of public health care as compared to those folks who have fair or poor health. And so this is sort of like a metaphor for what's happening in the housing market. All this money is going to, for-profit housing providers providing luxury and market rate units. And we are struggling with this corner of the market that is for those folks who have the highest need. And so that's a problem for us just from a cost and revenue perspective, but it's also a problem sort of socially, which is, if I skip around here, what I call the welfare problem. And I use that because that is sort of like the negative connotation that you hear, but that is what we're up against politically. So on one hand, we believe that social housing helps us avoid the Medicaid problem, where we're paying for higher needs and not sharing in that stronger market. But then we also want to avoid the welfare problem, which is we need higher and higher taxes to fund affordable housing for those needy other people. And the results of that are pretty devastating. We have public housing now in Minnesota, and we can see in this graph the gap between our capital investment need and our capital investment funding. So right now, MPH thinks that our current stock of public housing is about $200 million behind in their capital investment needs. And our current funding is around, I think it's a little higher in the years after this, but it's like still it's around 50 million or maybe 35 million or something like that. And so that's what happens when you have, a population in affordable housing completely bifurcated from the population, in the sort of more general market pool. And so we have this sort of, Jen is doing great work at IX trying to raise the voices, but you have this structural problem with how the system is set up to have affordable housing for this group and then the rest of the market over here. And it falls on the general state budget to try and make up the difference. But that's a really difficult political lift. And so the long-term benefit is one of the sort of key potential things we get out of social housing. And I've made this very simple stylized chart to just show how that works. So right now, this is what Sean was talking about. After 30 years, most deals that are funded through the low-income housing tax credit, we start to phase out of affordability. So every year we invest another, in Minnesota, it's around $12 million of LIHTC funds, about $120 million of projects every year. And so we fund about that much, and you can probably adjust it for inflation. But every year you make that same investment, you create a certain amount of units. But then after a certain amount of time, you're losing units at the same rate that you're adding them. And so without public ownership, we are essentially paying to keep this hamster wheel going. And we don't capture the long-term benefits. So what we have here is LIHTC in blue. We create more units over time, and then we start to lose them. And so we flatten out, and the number of affordable units just remains flat. With the social housing model, we fund a lower proportion of affordable units initially, but we keep those units affordable in a sustainable manner over time. And the other thing we do that I think is significant is that we're funding that other 80 or 70% of units that are not affordable at the same rate of AMI, but they are still more units of housing that we are creating that are rent stabilized, that don't necessarily even need to be market rate. They just need to be like a little above cost neutral. And so we're creating more housing supply, which we know also drives down the market cost of housing. And so the yellow dashed line is the total number of units you could fund like per dollar essentially over time. And so an important feature of the social housing model is that you're creating more and more units over, like the longer the program goes on, the greater the advantage it has over LIHTC because you're retaining these units. So this is like very simple stylized. I think there's like some tricky things about the numbers and comparing them. You could argue that this understates the value of social housing. I think you could also say that it overstates the value because right now we get those LIHTC dollars for free, and it's not an argument to do one or the other, but this is the comparison. And I think the long-term horizon is really important. So, I mean, all to just say that I think that this is like a very clever design and it's a very, you know, positive use of our dollars because of the upstream, the ability to address upstream housing problems before they become downstream, you know, social problems. And also the long-term value that we get in stabilizing the housing market and using the, you know, public wealth to create more long-term housing. And I think that some of the folks we've worked with in the legislature, I would say, Sean said there's only 5 of them. I think there's a couple more that find this idea very interesting. And there's a lot of social benefits that I don't think we've talked about quite as much yet about, you know, creating housing options that are not just more affordable and more sustainable over time, but are, you know, good places to live where people can be proud to live. Where people can live with a broader cross section of our society. And I know like Representative Esther Agbaje, we know we're not in her district right now. I think she's just across the river, but that's something she talks about a lot. So there's lots of other benefits. I think that's most of the stuff I had to say. Sean, I don't know if you wanted me to talk at all about the capital stack. I think probably. Okay, cool. That's it.
Thank you, Eric, for a much deeper dive on kind of the theory behind this. So now we're going to talk about, okay, why social housing? How are systems broken? And when Jen and I started working on this project, we started saying, okay, this is great, but how are we going to take this theory and actually make it real? Because my 5 number was a little facetious, but still, one of the reasons that there's a problem is because taking new ideas like this from a screen and actually putting it into the bloodstream is extremely difficult and takes many, many years. It takes social movements. It takes a bunch of different strategies. So what I want to do, we're going to have 2 more sections here, and then we're going to put it open to discussion. I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about what we already have in Minnesota as our social housing model. We've called it locally owned and controlled housing. We've done that for a couple different reasons. One is because that is describing what it is. And 2, because we want a way to approach lawmakers and policymakers across the state in a way that won't make them very defensive. The 2 reactions we get when we kind of say what social housing is we get a critique on the left to say, well, we don't want public housing again. We've already done that, and it creates a whole lot of problems. And we get a critique on the right saying, oh, socialist, Marxist, collectivist, that's problematic. So to bring down those defenses a little bit, and for other reasons, we talk about locally owned and controlled housing. The other reason we talk about it is, as we were doing this work, we started to realize this actually already exists in Minnesota. We didn't have to go out and create a brand new program and a branding campaign and everything like that. It is already happening. So I want to talk to you about 2 counties that are already literally doing social housing. They would never call it that, but that is what it is. So we're going to use Olmsted County and Washington County. And it's really the county HRA, the Housing Redevelopment Authority. In Washington, it's called their Economic Development Authority. We're not going to go into why they call it like this, but essentially it's a part of the county that helps control and develop building and housing. In greater Minnesota, outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul, these are also the entities that run public housing. So in Olmsted County, what they do is their HRA, their Olmsted County HRA, They run public housing, so they have actual like public housing buildings, and they run the voucher program, and they run project-based Section 8 as well. But they also have a housing stock of around 200, 250 units that they just own as a county. These are things that, housing came onto the market. There weren't any developers around to actually pick it up. And so the county is like, well, we'll buy it and we'll run it. And for several years, as they were doing this, they made the case to the county board that this is actually a good investment for us because housing is a good investment, like Eric was talking about. And even board members who were like, oh, we're not in the housing business. We're not in the housing business. Like, yeah, but you are in the having good credit business. And this helps with that part of their books. It also houses a need. Olmsted County is kind of that middle type of county that has a lot of housing needs at not at the deeply affordable level, but definitely at that kind of mid affordability level. And then they used a company to do the property management. They hired a private company to help with the property management. What they realized over the last several years is that that company doing the property management wasn't a great landlord. And they wanted to run housing in a way that respected and kept people out of homelessness. That was like their mission because they're the county HRA. They already run public housing. And so they actually last year brought all of their property management in-house. And so now you have a situation in Olmsted County where they are essentially running social housing. It's a part of their HRA housing stock that's not public housing. They're also not relying on big investments from the federal government or from the state, but they're using the investments that they have through their county levy, which is their taxes, to run this program. It's not to the point where, we haven't looked in depth in their books yet. It's not to the point where it's super self-sustainable. Like they still have to subsidize it with some county dollars, but it's not at the level of need that, say, MPHA is at, the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority. They are doing a pretty good job using their current resources to run this housing stock, and then they kind of slowly add to it over time. When we ask them, what would you need in this space? They're like, well, more money would be good, more access to capital so that we could actually take, some of that giant milk jug or that water jug of the state budget. Let's just take a little bit of it, another teaspoon maybe, and create a pot where we could use that to enhance and create and expand our current housing portfolio and continue to run it as Olmsted County. Washington County is similar. Their Economic Development Authority owns housing. They actually have a shop inside their Economic Development Authority that has the ability to build and design and run housing. Basically, they are their own developer. And every 5 or 6 years or so, they convince the Washington County Board to loan them money in the form of local bonds. And they use that to build their own apartment, essentially. And we asked, how many have you built in the last 5 years? And they said 1. So again, if they had access to a state fund, another teaspoon in Mike Howard's jug, then they would be able to do more than essentially 1 per year. And then because they're running they're running social housing and not for profit, but to house people in their community and to fund their operating costs. If this pot of money was a loan, they'd happily pay it back over time, especially if it's a no interest loan or a very, very low interest loan. Because right now, Washington County, in order to do this model, has to borrow bonding dollars, which are not super cheap, or they have to tax their own folks in county levies. And the county board doesn't love doing that. That's why they only do it once every 5 years, if the timing is right. If they had a state fund to draw on, all of a sudden, the county politics shift and they're a lot more interested in making this a lot more common in their county. So after talking with Olmsted and Washington, they're not the only places doing this. There's others as well. These are probably 2 of the most developed. Dakota County is also well developed in this. What became clear is that what's really missing from Minnesota is not so much that we need a new model. Counties are doing it. It fits all the hallmarks of social housing. The last hallmark that I haven't talked about yet is the democratic control. And the nice thing about an HRA is 2 levels of democratic control. One, if the county is your landlord, then, and they're not running housing for a profit, they're essentially doing social housing, then the advocacy community can demand or ask that the leases reflect person-centered or tenant-centered priorities, like just cause eviction, which is kind of a holy grail of housing advocates, to the point where landlords have to have a good reason to kick you out or a reason to kick you out. You can just write that into the lease if the county's open to it. And because they don't want to be kicking people out and evicting people, Olmsted has not done this yet, but you can imagine a scenario where Olmsted County passes a resolution that all of their county-owned housing is just cause evictions only. So you can essentially have the tenants writing the leases or combining to write the leases with the county itself. The other level of democracy in this system is if your county is your landlord and they start getting really bad, well, then you vote them out. You vote in a better landlord. You cannot do that in the situation that was described earlier. You're at the whims of the market, which we've already talked about as being broken. So it's not necessarily a perfect system, but you ask Jen and the organizations and the renters you work with. Landlord A is this private landlord. Landlord B is a county where you have all of these potential features. Who would you rather be your landlord? It's going to be B every time. And it also has the added benefit of having, allowing for more organization. The folks organizing around housing, as we mentioned before, aren't going to go to the Capitol and demand more light. But if they see buildings owned by counties that are responsive to their needs, they're going to demand more social housing because it's meeting all of the needs in the ways that the private market can. And so maybe that teaspoon turns into 2 teaspoons, et cetera, et cetera. So what's become clear to us in talking to counties that yes, we already have this model. It's not funded in a sustainable way. And so what is a great use of state funding in this space, but another teaspoon of state dollars into locally owned and controlled housing. And the reason that is so appealing then is also because if you put an initial investment in, if it's run right, then the counties, after the loan is expired, will be able to repay it back. And now you have a revolving fund. And you start kind of replicating this around the state. So 2 years ago, we introduced a bill. It's House File 2943. Or Senate File 3647. Representative Agbaje is our lead author in the House, and Senator Bolden from Rochester, Olmsted County in the Senate. And what this bill would have done, it did not pass this session, but part of our work over the next summer and into next session is building the momentum and the demand for this program. Is it would have created a brand new revolving fund held at MHFA. Where counties could then draw out of that fund. They would have to use that money to run a program similar to Olmsted in Washington, where they balance their rents out to a broad spectrum of income ranges. They then use that model to pay back the loan, so it becomes a revolving loan program. And then there's a couple of features in counties taking this money. There's a couple of tenant-centered or democratic controlled features that they would have to incorporate into their housing. So we're essentially incentivizing replication of the Olmsted model and the Washington County model by creating a pot of money that would be housed at the state. And you wouldn't necessarily have to, the beauty of this model is you don't have to go every 10 years and ask for a new infusion of cash into this. It's kind of self-sustaining.
In Maryland, they turn over their fund 4 or 5 times every 20 years. So for every dollar you put in, you're getting it back 4 or 5 times essentially.
The last thing we want to talk about, and then I want to invite a guest from Local Progress to have the last piece of the presentation, and we'll open it up to questions, is, well, what about public housing? This sounds a lot like public housing. We already have public housing. I thought we've made somewhat of the case to say, you know, this isn't public housing. This chart kind of spells out the other ways in which this is not public housing. So traditional public housing, is it permanently affordable? Yes, but there's no mixed income wide range of AMI, and that adds to the fact that it's not sustainable in many ways. as Jen would also say, it's also extremely limiting who can qualify for the program. Only deeply affordable folks and no non-citizens are allowed in this. Plus all sorts of other issues you start to get into. Minneapolis Public Housing Authority. In a former life, I worked with renters at Legal Aid, and one of the hardest landlords to work with in the city is the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority. And so, again, it doesn't have the democratic tenant control in the way that locally owned and controlled has. And all the other types of public housing or publicly financed housing at this point have similar limitations that social housing, locally owned and controlled housing doesn't have. All right, I want to pass it to our last speaker and then open it to questions. So Julia from Local Progress, tell us a little bit about your organization and why you're interested in helping with this model.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Facenda. I'm the Minnesota chapter manager at Local Progress. And Local Progress is a network of local elected officials committed to advancing racial, economic, and gender justice. So we have a chapter in Minnesota that I work with, but we do have this national network of folks. And we really see the local level as a way to so many of the transformative policies that we see implemented come from the local level, come from the grassroots, come from the stories that we're hearing on the ground from our partners, from members, from constituents. And so, we really believe that transformation is, grassroots up. We can do this work on the local level and have impact and transform systems at the state and federal level as well. And so really, I'm here to just say that this, issue, obviously we all know the housing crisis is going strong and it impacts everyone across the country, and that we need new systems. We need policy solutions, plural. There's not one magic solution. We need more funding. And so what we've really been hearing from our members across the country is that it is a growing interest in social housing. And that there are models that exist, as we've heard from our, panelists today. But how are we looking to improve and create more possibility? And I think also the thing that our members are really curious about is like, how can we begin to do this work now so that in 30, 40, 50 years, the systems that we're setting up still exist and are sustainable, right? Because so many of our members across the country and here in Minnesota are dealing with issues of, Band-Aids, right? And that comes, when it's our members on the local level have to deal with the problems that these Band-Aids are not fixing, right? From the federal dollars and state, solutions that are really not like long-term sustainable solutions, right? So our members are saying, what's out there? How can Local Progress help bring people together? And so what we really are looking at is bringing in policy experts, partners like Jen at IX and others who are doing this work across the country with our members to learn and to begin to implement change. And, we took a cohort in April to Vienna, Austria to look at this model of, a model that has been around for a long time, a model that is successful, because it's really important to visualize, right? It's really important to see, like, this is possible. We do a lot harder things, right? So really bringing that possibility and inspiration home so that our members can take action and know that, like, in 30 years, this is what my community could look like. And so I just wanted to say that I have some examples from outside of Minnesota as well that I wanted to share, just to again reiterate that, like, across the country, members are excited, local elected officials and their communities are excited about this model. They're moving forward. There's no perfect solution or perfect model yet, you know, where every community is different. And we also really believe in that. There's not just one model we can take and replicate. Every model is going to be unique to a community. And especially when we have that democratic participation from the community, we know that models are just going to shift and be different. And that's like a good thing. So Seattle recently passed a ballot initiative on social housing, and that was led by one of our local progress members, Tammy Morales. And they have a social housing developer board, and they are working on implementation of the ballot amendment that was passed by voters. So that is continuing to move forward to begin to build and build publicly owned housing there. Again, that has a big democratic controlled component. State of California is currently working on a bill on social housing. Denver is conducting a study on how to move forward on social housing with, again, led by some local progress members there. Chicago just voted in April to amend its TIF process in order to bond for affordable housing funds that will create new funding opportunities specifically for social housing. And then Los Angeles recently approved a motion directing the housing department to start developing a social housing strategy. And that model will be specific to low-income housing or low-income ownership rather. And then we've already talked a little bit about Maryland and Montgomery County. But, you know, really what we see our role as local progress is bringing together folks for learning opportunities. We're taking these learnings, putting together resources for our members. And we really hope to, you know, continue to be a place where folks can come together to learn, but then also to go take action, because we need this, you know, clearly, I think you all have made a really great case and argument for why this is needed. And so like, we are here to help our members be able to take action in their own communities.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. I think we're going to turn it back over for questions. So just a couple of notes on mechanics of questions. If you're online, you can send your question to the email that you see on the screen. And we will be able to email these slides out when it's all done. There's a bunch of resources at the end of this, including links to a lot of the issues that or resources we talked about. But how do you want to deal with, why don't we start with questions in the room?
In rural counties that have a housing redevelopment authority having this program, do the more urban counties have those authorities, or are we looking at the municipal authority?
Great question. Maybe I'll start, and Jen, you can fill in. So the question was, you know, when you're thinking about housing redevelopment authorities, which I said are kind of the home to locally owned and controlled housing, very common in rural greater Minnesota. How does it work necessarily in the urban counties? So I would say HRAs are statewide, and you definitely, this model definitely works well it works really well in kind of the mid-tier Goldilocks counties, the Dakotas, the Washingtons, and the Olmsteds, in terms of just naturally occurring, because they're big enough to have resources. They're small enough to not have, like, Minneapolis Public Housing Authority. They already run a lot of their own public housing, so they have some infrastructure. So they're kind of a perfect natural hub for this seed to kind of start growing. What we're trying to do is to plant seeds everywhere else and water the current stuff that's currently happening. So we do think those counties are kind of the easiest places to really kind of continue to water this model. In terms of bigger urban counties, so Hennepin and Ramsey, they do have HRAs, and they do have the mechanism, and they have a lot of resources that you could fund and replicate a model like this. The challenge with those two counties and Hennepin in particular is that now we're in a space where there's all these, it kind of goes back to the point we're making earlier about all these kind of competing governing bodies kind of pointing at each other and saying, well, you're in charge of this, you're in charge of this, you're in charge of this. The biggest thing for Hennepin County is that Minneapolis Public Housing Authority has all the infrastructure to run quote unquote public housing. And so the Hennepin County HRA hasn't built or flexed those similar types of muscles. And so it's easier for the Hennepin County HRA to be a lot more like the Minnesota Public Housing Finance Agency, where it's like, well, we'll just be a pass-through. We'll just kind of give the money to nonprofits to do the work because we haven't really built our muscles up the way that Dakota or Olmsted has. We are in the process of challenging that. We don't necessarily agree to that. That's part of why kind of, I think, local progress and talking with individual commissioners and staff, we want to be really collaborative because we actually think this model would work really well in the Hennepins and Ramseys, especially if there's a state fund that they're drawing from and they don't have to draw on existing resources as much. But it's going to depend on each of those kind of individual counties to because the MPHA doesn't meet the need that social housing would fix. And so it is going to depend on those bigger counties to recognize that they too can help with that need. Anything to add? Great question. Others?
That's it for this issue. So I, like kind of a two-parter. One is that a lot of the presentation was framed on like an opposition or tension for this model, the existence of LIHTC. And I'm wondering is that an important thing to have as a tension in the narrative? Is that something that you're presenting to lawmakers when you're advocating for this model? And then the second part is for that lobbying. Is that coming, like, do we have cities on board with this yet? Like, I think a League of Minnesota Cities is a really strong lobbying organization. We saw them in some ways kind of kill the missing middle work that was being done in the state this session. So how do you get organizations like LMC and others that represent cities to go for this?
Let me repeat the question, just so everyone can hear it online as well. So the question is essentially asking about messaging, really, really good stuff. The first is, do you necessarily have to have an adversarial type of relationship with LIHTC? And how is that being perceived under the dome at the Capitol? Paraphrasing. And then the second is, are you going to get cities on board or other kind of big power players, especially cities? The reference was to League of Minnesota Cities, which is one of the most powerful lobbying organizations we have in the state and effectively killed a bill affectionately known as Missing Middle, which I've also worked on, which is essentially trying to take away years of exclusionary zoning principles in cities and help with more supply, essentially, to really take a summary at your question. So two parts. Which one do you want to take? What? Okay, so let's talk about this adversarial question. Do we have to adversarially be opposed to LIHTC? I'll just quickly say, like, this is a both and solution. We're not going to fund locally owned housing with $1 billion and all of a sudden take over the LIHTC system. However, I do think there is some natural tension that exists, and I think it's okay to lean into that tension a little bit, but I'll let Jen talk a little bit more.
Well, like, oh, wow. Like Sean said, so LIHTC it's federal money and we're going to the state. And so we're not going to get rid of the federal money in the way that it works. I think about it as let's build an alternative here in Minnesota so that when we're ready to take on the federal money, we can say, can we put that a different direction? We've built infrastructure across the country. And I think it's important to have some tension about LIHTC so that public money in Minnesota isn't spent bolstering that system, right? I would say both LIHTC and Section 8 vouchers, right? There are campaigns to expand Section 8 vouchers. They may be a good short-term solution, but again, for my membership, those vouchers are going to corporate landlords who are treating people really badly. And so we need to make sure to say that. Again, I think we need to talk about social housing on its merits and just call out that these solutions aren't working in the ways that they're not.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that it is a messaging question though, so it's really well-formed question in that I think the reason to talk about LIHTC is that we need to like shift the paradigm in which we think about investing in housing. And LIHTC, in the ways that Jen is passionate about saying, and I agree, really embodies what's wrong with the way we approach this problem, and frankly, a lot of social problems. And so like getting people to think about the power we have here in the state to go towards the same goals that LIHTC is theoretically supposed to pursue. So it's a very useful foil for explaining the virtues of our solution. And I think that's why we talk about LIHTC. When it comes to the actual nuts and bolts, LIHTC, we get about $12 to $15 million of actual tax credits in Minnesota every year. That leverages about 10 times that amount, 9 times that amount in investment. So you're getting about $120, $150 million of affordable housing investment in Minnesota as a result of LIHTC. We wouldn't say no to that. But the other thing that's worth the reason we bring up LIHTC, I think, is because it's really silly. Like the budget is about $65 billion. And we're spending a couple hundred million on it. So like we could like triple, quadruple, whatever the LIHTC budget, even with the private money, and it would still be Michael Howard's 4 tablespoons out of the jug. So like the fact that we're so caught up in this LIHTC system sort of really illustrates how silly we're being about our lack of investment in public housing. So just wanted to add that. And then on the local control thing, or the zoning thing, I would just say, I don't want to give LMC too much credit. I've got a good friend who lobbies for them. And I think we lost that issue because the public wasn't there and the legislature wasn't there. I think the public in the Twin Cities is there, but it just so happens that we have a lot of suburbs in this state. And so I just want to say, like, LMC is an important actor. Maybe you'll have a different perspective on this, but there were just also a lot of legislators who live in the suburbs and who felt really NIMBY-ish about this idea. And so, you know, I agree that their cities are something to consider, but this idea is a little different because it's offering something rather than taking something away.
Those are all really good points. I'll use one more example to hit on both of them. So talking with Washington County HRA and listening to this essentially social housing that they've already invented, they would never call it that because it doesn't resonate in the same way, but that's essentially what it is. They've encountered a couple of very interesting problems that hit on both the messaging and the nuts and bolts of what we're talking about. First of all, counties can use LIHTC, they're allowed to, but and it would be a really useful vehicle for Washington County to use, but the political pressure from commissioners and just the developer class that's existed says, no, LIHTC is for developers. And so Washington would love to use LIHTC and they can't for essentially political reasons. So they distribute all their LIHTC to private actors. And like I said, every 5 years, maybe they convince their board to give them some bonds to do more development. So everything that these two said about the messaging is it's a useful foil. When need be, in practicality, it's not going away and it is still part of our system. There's also a lot of people in the, I think, affordable housing space who use LIHTC who know it's flawed and feel trapped. Like this is all we have and we haven't created alternatives yet. So we're hoping that when the bandwagon will increase once we kind of get the spigot of locally owned flowing. The other really interesting thing that Washington County said, going to the LMC point, LMC, by the way, League of Minnesota Cities, I think they really like this idea because it's money for housing from the state. So I think the cities will get on board. But another interesting tidbit from the counties is once they move into the locally owned and controlled kind of developer space, now they're actually going to encounter some of the same NIMBY issues that private developers and nonprofit developers face. So one of the biggest clashes we've seen over the last couple of years is a nonprofit developer named Beacon Housing. They tried to develop this huge, or not huge, relatively small apartment complex in Shakopee, and just have look it up online, just gotten NIMBY'd over years and years and years, not in my backyard. Don't want to build affordable housing for those people here in Shakopee. Washington County and these other HRAs, they will encounter the same problem. As they try to build these types of projects, there will be cities within their counties saying the same exact thing. So it will create some interesting dynamics. And back to the messaging point, one of the things that we are trying to do as a coalition is just like the Missing Middle Coalition, try to be very diverse. our best messenger in many ways are the county bureaucrats coming and saying, yeah, we need $50 million for a new program, not just because renters are telling you that, but because the counties owning and operating are doing that. Those groups also start to get involved in the zoning issues. Now you've also kind of put more pressure on why we need some of those exclusionary zoning principles changed as well, so. Super thoughtful question, thanks.
So somebody asked, local city council, city HRA. I certainly see the ways in which zoning and planning commission, however, resources are more difficult to ask. We as a council are tired of granting tips, implementing financing, but it is the main way that we can build affordable housing.
Great question. I think everyone heard that. City councils themselves, are tired of granting TIF, which is a tax credits, part of that being held hostage issue. And so, Jen, why don't you take this one?
So we want to set up the state fund so that cities and counties can access it. So that cities can decide, we want our HRA to build this also. So I think there is a role for cities to decide, we're going to access this funding and build and own housing as well. You know, people keep talking about Vienna. When people talk about Vienna, more than half of the housing in the city of Vienna is owned by the city of Vienna, right? So like it could be a city that owns this. We've been focusing on counties because we found examples of counties doing it, but that doesn't stop cities from doing it also.
That needs to exist between cities and counties is really critical here.
Yeah, Julia pointed out the partnership piece, and that's exactly what I was going to add. The bill that we introduced creates the fund and it creates some parameters that have to be used. It specifically allows cities, tribes, and counties to be the owners and operators. And we would envision a lot of situations where the city and county would co-own. And you can imagine counties that are reluctant to get into this business, quote unquote, could be pushed from their cities to say, let's do this. And we'll each put a little skin in the game and we'll hit this pot and we'll own it together. Cities that are a little reluctant to do this because of the NIMBY issue can be pushed by the counties and by other neighboring cities as well. So it really is actually we do not see any of the municipalities being passive actors in this realm. Everyone has a role to play. It might look a little different from place to place and jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but that's the message that we're bringing to local electeds and state electeds all over the state.
Well, thanks for grabbing. All right. I'm sure we could talk about this for another couple days, probably at least maybe. But thank you for everybody who came today to this Grace Housing Forum. Thank you to all of our panelists. We'll make sure that we get all of their materials out. I'll also say that CURA recently did a report on LIHTC funding and sort of the problems of it. And I think we should include that maybe perhaps in the materials as well too. Oh, that's one of the resources that are in here as well too. So we'll make sure we get all those resources out. Otherwise, thank you for all being here. I hope you have a great rest of your Friday and weekend, and we look forward to having you again soon. Thanks. Thank you.